Well, good Friday afternoon for everyone joining us on Wavy.com and the Wavy Facebook page. I'm Jason Marks, here to talk about Chapter 7 of The Patience vs. Perwaiz. This is our online docu-series exclusive to Wavy.com that we started working on more than a year ago, featuring Dr. Javed Perwaiz. He is the Chesapeake OBGYN who was convicted of health insurance fraud for doing unnecessary surgeries, including hysterectomies, on his patients. Now, we are at Chapter 7. We started obviously with Chapter 1. We have to go to Chapter 10, so we are well over the halfway point at this point. And Chapter 7 really focused on children and the births that Dr. Perwaiz was involved in, whether it was from his pregnant patients or from patients' deliveries that he had. Let's give you a little sneak peek of what you'll see on Wavy.com right now.
Even though it could have done this a little bit earlier, this was the right decision. This is a pandemic. This requires the NCAA and all the member institutions to join with the other leagues.
Once I found out about all these things that he had done, I was disgusted and just sad, felt betrayed, you know, like I'd been not given the chances that everyone else had been given.
He's always thought that someone deliberately hurt him.
It's always been a little more difficult for me because everyone else is considered normal and I'm not.
I just assumed it was a fluke accident.
I just keep running into one roadblock or another. My life's been ruined by this one person.
They told me they didn't think he'd ever walk and talk in 9 months. But, okay,
I can't believe that someone would be this much of a monster.
It's been devastating for me after all these years to find out that it wasn't a fluke accident, and obviously was his inability to perform the procedure right.
I just have a lot of issues that aren't seen on the surface, but they're just as bad as a lot of the issues that people see on the surface.
And when this came forward, the first words out of his mouth was he wants to tell the whole world and anyone else who was hurt that they're not the only ones and it wasn't an accident. Because it couldn't be an accident if it happened to all these people. If I'd known, he wouldn't have touched my baby. He wouldn't have touched me. And I would have made sure he wouldn't touch anybody else either.
So we're talking about Chapter 7, and we're getting into the births, meaning the patients who were pregnant, the births that Dr. Perwaiz delivered, the babies, or just his OB side of things when it came to pregnancies and how he treated his pregnant women. Before we go any farther, let me introduce you to my colleagues. There's Adrienne Mayfield, investigative producer, back from her birthday weekend last week, a little bit older now. And then Kevin Rahm's on the bottom there. He is the one who is editing all of these things, these chapters, and making them look great. Guys, how are you doing this weekend?
I'm well. I am very moved by this chapter. I think this is one of the most emotional for me.
Yeah, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely the most emotional, I think, for me as well.
So when you just saw Terry and Jonathan, we start off Chapter 7 talking about them. Now, Terry and Jonathan are mother and son, and Terry she was a patient of Dr. Perwaiz in the early 80s, and she also ended up working for him. Perwaiz actually delivered her son, Jonathan, and we found there was a lawsuit that was filed in Chesapeake Circuit Court years ago by Terry and Jonathan's name, and that lawsuit was eventually dismissed. They believe that Perwaiz's lack of care really led to Jonathan's issues, where he has a shunt in his head. He's had a shunt since he was a baby, and continues to have a shunt. And what the shunt does is it allows the fluid that builds up on the brain to drain into the stomach area. If not, it could kill him. And that happened during the birth, where Dr. Perwaiz used some forceps to pull Jonathan out of Terry, and they believe that he was injured through that process. Now, Kevin, let's start here, because this is an interesting story, because we found this story out in February, and we decided to drive down to the Atlanta area about a year ago in March, right around as the pandemic was about to hit.
Yeah, I mean, it was really before what we know now of the pandemic. I mean, it's kind of crazy to look back a year ago and to be thinking about us driving down there in March of 2020, not really knowing what was ahead for us and for the country, really. And when we got down there and we talked to Jonathan and his mom, and we were introduced to Jonathan's son, I mean, it was a heartbreaking story. I mean, just for him to tell us everything that he's had gone through for his entire life, literally from the time he was born, and what he's going to have to continue to go through. I mean, he talks about how many surgeries he's had, major brain surgeries, and major brain surgeries that he's going to have in the future because of that shunt and because of the limitations that he now has to deal with. He talks about fine motor skill issues and the lack of ability for him to be able to get certain kinds of jobs because of those limitations. I mean, it's just one thing after another for him and for what he has to go through for the rest of his life.
And Adrian, you didn't make that trip to Atlanta with us, but when you heard, you were on the phone, we did the interview with Terry and Jonathan. When you heard what they were telling us, what was your first thought?
Well, Jonathan's just a couple of years older than me. And the thing that really moved me about his story was the amount of pain and resentment that he still carries with him, even into his older age, and how that's been amplified for him as a father who's gone through a birthing experience and is now watching his child grow up and have flexibility and abilities that he didn't have. I just imagine what it must be to feel that frustrated. He talked about not being able to tie his own shoes until he was 10 years old. He talked about not being able to bathe himself until he was a teenager. And, you know, we've all been sick, right? We've all been in a position where temporarily we felt like we couldn't care for ourselves, but to be mentally cognizant and feel so frustrated by your inability to do things that other people in your developmental range are doing, it really, I mean, it struck a chord with me.
And we found out that this wasn't the only birth that Dr. Perwaiz was accused of being involved in where a child was injured, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've identified several births, including another child who has some physical disabilities. That family chose not to interview with us, but we do know that the son struggles with some of the similar disabilities that Jonathan does. And then, of course, with Asia Wiggins and her child who has Bell's palsy. We also talked with another family who chose not to interview with us, whose child also has Bell's palsy, and they've got an attorney right now. So it really seems like forceps, the use of forceps is a theme throughout a lot of these pregnancies.
Sure. And then we found also that it seems like there have been some civil cases against Dr. Perwaiz over the years, and he settled 2 cases. One of those was for another infant who was seriously harmed, who's still in a wheelchair today. He's now an adult, I should say, and they settled the family years ago for $725,000.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We're gonna just choose not to say his name here out of privacy for his family, but he did have to settle that case, and obviously when you're living with a lifetime of disability, that money isn't going to go very far. So his family, I'm sure, has had to be very flexible in their care for him.
And so we're starting to get some Facebook comments now. Kim just wrote in, I just want to know why the nurses didn't come forward way back instead of the patients. That's an interesting thing. You know, we're going to try to tackle that, I believe, in chapter 9. But when you're talking about nurses, there's a nurse eventually did come forward, and that was how this whole investigation started with the FBI. But obviously, the medical profession is tight-knit, and you know, nurses, I think, from what we understand, don't necessarily like to rat on doctors. And they did go to their supervisors, some of them, and nothing was ever done. And I guess that was frustrating to them. Not enough, though, to go to the Board of Medicine, guys.
Yeah, I mean, we were just having an interesting conversation yesterday with somebody who you all will meet in Chapter 9, who formerly on the Board of Medicine, who says that it's not that nurses don't want to rat doctors out. I mean, they'll be the first ones to call out a doctor when they're doing something wrong. But his question was, why didn't these nurses go to the Board of Medicine? It's a good question. They did go to their supervisors, and you would hope that following that first chain of command was enough. But it wasn't. Jason, you listened to a nurse from Harborview who used a very interesting term when she referred to babies who were delivered by Dr. Perwaiz. Do you want to talk about her testimony?
You know, obviously there was a 5-week trial, and the prosecutors brought in nurses from both Harborview, which is Bon Secours Harborview. That's a surgery center in Suffolk, and then also Chesapeake Regional, and that's where most of Dr. Perwaiz's work took place, the surgeries over at Bon Secours. He also did surgeries at Chesapeake Regional, but he did most of his birth, or all of his births, at Chesapeake Regional. And I can tell you that a neonatal intensive care nurse who deals with premature babies and babies who need special care testified on the stand that they would routinely see babies that were born early from Dr. Perwaiz and needed special care, and they named those babies Perwaiz specials. And as we know, during the trial, there were several names, that one included, that nurses had for Dr. Perwaiz. At Bon Secours, whenever he did surgeries on those days, they called it a Perwaizathon. And that was because you had all of these patients all at one time show up to the surgery center, many of them not knowing why they were there to begin with. It was very chaotic, very hectic, and so they called it a Perwaizathon. So you had Perwaiz specials over at Chesapeake Regional. I think what's amazing about this is we start to get into births, but we also start to talk about early inductions, and this was a big part of the chapter.
Yeah, early inductions were a really big part of the chapter, and they were actually a really big part of the case against him. So for those of you who don't have children, children aren't supposed to be born before 39 weeks with an induction. So a doctor's not supposed to decide to deliver your baby prior to 39 weeks unless there's a medical reason that they need to. And what prosecutors alleged and what Dr. Perwaiz was convicted of was inducing women prior to 39 weeks, essentially so he could build his own schedule. So if you watch this chapter, you'll meet a woman named Asia. She had a due date since her first appointment with Dr. Perwaiz. It was for an April due date, and she said very suddenly her due date got moved up by more than a week, and he didn't give her a reason, and he just said, be here this day, and he scheduled her for it, and he induced her. At that point in time, she wasn't in labor, she wasn't dilated, he broke her water, and she feels like her baby wasn't ready to come out. I mean, her body most certainly was not trying to give birth at that time.
And Kevin, you dug through, we all dug through,
Yeah,
obviously, paperwork and looking at some of the materials, the medical records, and you saw, I mean, as you were editing this thing, you saw the theme, right? When it came to the original due date by the Perwaiz patients.
yeah, and I mean, Adrian brings up a great point in Asia's story with her son. And to me, the part when we focus on Asia's story in this chapter, that is the part, the story that really, I guess, broke my heart, at least, because when she's talking about her son being born, it's supposed to be one of the happiest moments in your life, and that's what you hope for. And she said as he was being born, he wasn't breathing when they took him out, and how heartbreaking it was for her to not be able to hold her baby as soon as he was born. He had to go and be put on oxygen to survive, and just what the emotion that brought to her, and to not be able to hold her son when he was born, and to just immediately have to start worrying about his life and his livelihood. I just cannot even imagine what that was like for her to go through, and it's something that, you know, can never be given back to her. And
yeah,
unfortunately, it was taken from her, and unfortunately, she wasn't the only one that had to deal with that. I mean, we saw, like you were talking about the documents, it was just document after document saying that he was inducing these women less than 39 weeks with no medical reason whatsoever.
Yeah, and I will tell you, he testified, and he was asked, obviously, by prosecutors about these early inductions, and he said he had his own system, where he was looking at it, and he had the system, and he knew what he was doing, and he had done this so long that he was able to figure out when the woman was ready. But there's a reason why you have that 39-week that benchmark in place, and that's because doctors will tell you that an infant's, a newborn's lungs aren't healthy until they get to at least the 39-week mark, and that's why you're not allowed to induce early unless it's medically necessary, meaning if the mother's in danger or the baby's in danger, and there's a reason why you have to go and take out the baby before 39 weeks. And we saw he was at Maryview delivering babies in about the 2002 time period, and you saw that Maryview documented 30 times in 4 years where he went ahead and he took out babies before 39 weeks without any medical reason.
Yeah, so I think it's also important to really address, why? Because babies are going to come, right? And if you've got a regular routine pregnancy, most often you're going to just go into labor naturally. You'll call the hospital, you'll get there, and whichever OB is who delivers your baby. But what prosecutors alleged was that Dr. Perwaiz wanted to get paid for all of these births. So not just the OB care leading up to the birth, he wanted to make sure that he was the one to deliver the baby so he could get paid. And in fact, Dr. Perwaiz told investigators himself he had a guy on call just in case he couldn't make it to the hospital. But he told federal investigators, I've never missed the birth of one of my patients. I'm there for everyone. And maybe he meant that positively, but prosecutors say that wasn't so kind-spirited. It wasn't supportive. It was about money.
Yeah, so what he would do is, many times what he would do is if you were a patient who was pregnant and you were due, let's say, April 12th, he would say, come on in, and he would change that date to like April 8th, April 2nd. Come on in on a Saturday. I'm going to be there anyway. Come on in, we're going to induce you. Many of these times, these patients, these women, were not dilated and they were not in labor. So he would start giving them Pitocin and essentially create labor, and then they would deliver. And then we know the rest of the story where some of them ended up in the NICU unit and they were Perwaiz specials. So obviously this chapter covers everything when it comes to births. And it really is, as you guys mentioned, just a heartbreaking chapter.
Yeah, it's really emotional. I mean, you think about babies, there's nothing more innocent in the world than a baby. They haven't had an opportunity to make mistakes yet. They haven't had an opportunity to experience life. And so really, these children are subject to the adults around them, to the care that's provided for them. And that's why I think Jonathan's story moved me so much, because you hear about something awful that happens to a child, but you don't always get to see what that looks like throughout the years. And so Jonathan, who is one of the children, now a grown man in this episode, he's almost kind of like the, not the prelude, but the postlude, what's, the reflection of what other children featured in this chapter may have to go through as they grow up.
And he's so angry because when you look at it, he never even got a chance, compared to how fortunately healthy we were. He was dealt all these setbacks from the moment he came into the world, and it's really a shame. So that was chapter 7.
And
go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, and what I was just going to say, I mean, and he touched on it, and it's another facet of how heartbreaking his story is and how he felt a responsibility, even though he mentions it, even though he was just a baby and there was nothing he could really do about it at that point. But because nothing was done to Perwaiz after what was done to Jonathan, Jonathan said he's lived his entire life feeling like he almost has a sense of responsibility to share his story to so many other people who may have gone through something similar to this with Dr. Perwaiz, and it weighs heavy on him. He almost feels a responsibility for what Perwaiz went on to do after what happened to him, and I think it's a heavy burden that he really should not have to carry.
Yeah, so ironic because he is an infant when the lawsuit's filed in his name, and nothing that he could have done in court to get that lawsuit dismissed. But and you may ask, why was it dismissed? Well, because back then, even today, it's really hard to prove medical malpractice, and I think Terry saw the writing on the wall that it was going to be very difficult, and I think she just decided to essentially let the lawsuit lapse, and I don't even think it ever even made it to the courtroom.
Yeah, it's difficult and expensive to try and prosecute medical malpractice.
And then she just left the area and to try to get Dr. Perwaiz out of her mind as far as possible, and I think he was until he was arrested. So that's chapter 7. We're talking about births. Guys, chapter 8 really gets into the money, and what we do is we know that this whole thing, according to prosecutors, revolves around Dr. Perwaiz's greed and wanting to line his own pockets on the backs of his patients. But what did he spend his money on? And where did the money come from? And how did that work? And that's what we're looking at here in Chapter 8.
Yeah, Chapter 8, I think, is going to be an interesting one, because when we heard the initial kind of big figure of what Dr. Perwaiz made, we thought, well, that's a lot of money, but let's put it in context. And we're talking double what other similarly situated OBs make. And then
Probably triple.
yeah, it's a lot of money just in the last 10 years. And you look at what he spent the money on, but also what those items are worth now. I don't want to give away too much, Jason, but we do find out he's got a big net worth, not just in, you know, properties, but like in physical items in his home.
Yeah, we go into that, and Kevin's working on that right now in the edit bay. Started to edit that particular chapter, the Chapter 8, which is just dealing with money, and then Chapter 9 is going to deal with all the red flags and responsibility, which is the reason why we're doing this. Who dropped the ball? Is there anyone who dropped the ball? And so Chapter 8 is really going to be important, because it really lays out where that money was coming from and how much money he made and where he was spending that money. And I think you'll be very surprised when you see some of his purchases over the last 7 years or 10 years, because they're pretty shocking.
Yeah, most certainly. What did you think, Kevin, when you first saw that itemized list?
Yeah, it was definitely eyebrow raising for sure, and I think you put it into perfect context. Like, we're just trying to put into context the amount of money that he made, and I think by showing how much money he was spending at certain retail stores or other kind of outlets, it really put into perspective how much money that is, and what you can get with that kind of money. And I mean, he definitely was a fan of swiping that credit card as much as possible. I mean, I'm surprised you didn't light it on fire how much he was swiping his credit card.
He was a fan of QVC. And we're not going to say how much he spent at QVC, but he evidently liked QVC a lot.
But it's like almost a revolving door too, because he made a lot of money, but he was spending a lot of money. It's almost like, you know, people live in paycheck to paycheck, but his paychecks are just a lot bigger than ours.
So before we let you go for the day, we just want you to know that there has been an update on his trial. If you haven't heard, not his trial, but his sentencing. If you haven't heard, sentencing was supposed to be in a couple weeks. Due to COVID and scheduling issues, because trials right now in the courts, they only can do one jury trial at a time. And so when you have a jury trial that's up, you have to take it. And one of his attorneys had a jury trial, and so we had to reschedule the sentencing, which will take place in May. We can tell you that the prosecutors are still looking for patients who want to write a victim impact statement to still do that. If you might have a chance in court to see him face to face, even if you weren't in the criminal indictment. You may have a chance to see him face to face and let him know how he impacted your life. And then the other thing that is really we want to make sure that everyone knows about is this network that was set up with therapists called the Women's Resource Collaborative. And that was the FBI got together with some local therapists and created a network. And there's a website. You can find it on our website, wavy.com. And of course, look for the Patients First Perwaiz, and you can find that particular link to it. But they're great resources for anyone who thinks they need to talk. Obviously, a lot of these patients, if you're a patient of them, you might be suffering from PTSD or have some other issues that you're dealing with that you just don't know how to deal with, or feel like you need to talk to someone. That's all there for you. And those are great resources, guys, that are right there at your fingertip.
Yeah, and I know that the Women's Resource Collaborative is offering a lot of free resources and also cost-effective resources, because it's really important to them that they're able to make these resources available to any person or family member who has been impacted by Dr. Perwaiz. We interviewed a therapist recently, and she just wants the audience and patients to know that the doors are open. It doesn't have to be today or tomorrow. It could be 6 months from now. But when you feel like you're ready to talk about it, they're going to be there to connect you with the right person to help.
Yeah, and at some point they do want to get groups together, because obviously these patients have a bond that they probably never would want to ask for, but they are bonded together, and they all have similar stories. And I think the therapists really want to get some group sessions going with all of the patients.
Yeah, just offer support. You know, you go through something
Sure.
together, but you're not alone. And I think that's really important. It can feel very isolating, as some of our patients have said, like, I feel alone, I feel like I'm not smart, how did I fall for this? But then you just realize, like, you're not alone. It's not a deficiency with you.
Well, absolutely. So that's all on wavy.com. Kevin's going to get back to work on Chapter 8. Chapter 8 comes out Thursday morning at midnight. Hard to believe we're already in Chapter 8. The other 7 chapters are on wavy.com right now. And if you, it's miserable outside, it's not going to be a great weekend. So if you have time and you haven't seen any chapters, you may just want to sit down and binge the first 7. I think they're worth it. And it will sort of give you the scope of everything that Dr. Perwaiz was convicted of doing. And you'll hear these emotional stories from the brave women who really stepped up to tell us their stories. And of course, guys, we'll be back here again next Friday at 1:15 to talk about Chapter 8 and to talk about all of that spending. Where was that money going and what was he spending on at QVC? That's what we'll talk about, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, everyone have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here next Friday. Kevin, you got one last word?
No, just can't wait till next Friday. We can dive in deeper.
I can't wait to see Chapter 9 or 8. I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead.
Well, we'll see everyone back here next Friday. Have a great weekend.